I'm Francis Shen with the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society, and really excited to be joined today by Dr. Patricia Churchland. Dr. Churchland is a professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, also adjunct professor at the Salk Institute. She has been awarded many prizes, including the MacArthur Prize, the Rossi Prize for Neuroscience, and the Prose Prize for Science, and is also one of the founders of the field of neurophilosophy. So Dr. Churchland, thanks for being with us and sharing your wisdom with the Career Network. And I'd like to start with just a pair of related questions, which are, what is neurophilosophy, and how did you decide to pursue this intersection of neuroscience and philosophy in your career?
Well, you might ask. Well, as I thought of neurophilosophy, it is the intersection between those questions that are very traditional in philosophy about the nature of the mind. How do we make decisions? How do we solve problems? How do we remember? How does our non-conscious stuff work together with our consciousness? I mean, when I'm talking to you, for example, I can't make a decision about precisely what I'm going to say. I know sort of roughly, but my non-conscious brain is very busy making sure that it comes out more or less coherent. So it was those philosophical questions that I had a fairly long-term interest in. But I also realized that neuroscience was doing some very interesting things, and that ultimately the questions I was interested in were, what are the mechanisms for making decisions, or for seeing, or for remembering? And so it was really about the brain. How does the brain do these things? So neurophilosophy then is the intersection between neuroscience on the one hand and these philosophical questions on the other. But having said that, I should qualify it a little bit, because it's not just neuroscience, as it turns out, that has relevant scientific data to the philosophical questions, but also, of course, genetics and anthropology in particular. And so now I really think that it's any scientific endeavor that might help us understand brain mechanisms for making us what we are.
And it's really exciting. As you moved through your career, how did you balance the need to understand and be expert in philosophy on the one hand, but also be conversant, and more than conversant, deeply engaged in these other fields? How did you balance that need for different training and experience, since you're working across multiple areas?
Well, to be absolutely honest, Paul and I started at the University of Manitoba, and the honesty comes here. They took a very relaxed view towards research productivity. As long as we met our classes and did a really good job teaching, they didn't really care that much about what else we did. So that left me time if I organized properly. And one day I could not understand from a book what the heck the thalamus is. And I knew I had to know the anatomy of the thalamus if I was going to understand anything about the brain. So I went down to the medical school and I knocked on the door of an anatomist, and he was English, and his name was John Baskerville Hyde. And he thought this was just wonderful. So he said, okay, I'm going to work with you. Good anatomist as he was. And he said, the first thing you have to know is basic anatomy. So you should take all of the undergraduate or the first year medical courses, and you should take the lab. And I will get you your own human brain in your own Tupperware pot, and you will take it apart and you will see. And that was the beginning. And of course, once you get to know the anatomy, so much else suddenly becomes readable. Otherwise, it's not readable. You don't like, well, what is this? What's connecting to what? And when we moved to San Diego, then I was even luckier in a way, because there were already people who wanted to do, as it were, these high level questions about the nature of neuroscience. And in particular, at the Salk was Francis Crick. And I got to know him very early. In fact, he was part of what got us to move to San Diego. And then I had met Terry Sainovsky in the meanwhile at Johns Hopkins. And Francis Crick and I persuaded Terry to move to San Diego. And Terry opened his lab at the Salk Institute, and I became part of Terry's lab. I guess that was in 1986. And I've been part of that lab ever since. And once you're part of a lab and part of the, what the questions are that are motivating the graduate students and the lab chief, you get drawn in. And but I kind of let philosophy go, quite honestly, because there wasn't that much happening.
It's a really neat story. I hadn't known that bit about the anatomy. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it was amazing. And it wasn't just the University of Manitoba Arts and Sciences faculty that didn't worry about research, but actually, although the medical school was very good, they weren't snotty. I mean, they weren't arrogant. They had such a high opinion of themselves that they thought, a philosopher knocking on their door was beneath them. Whereas I think there are many medical schools at that time anyway, who would have said, please go away.
I'm glad they didn't.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for students watching this who maybe have read your book or, read about the field, they're starting to learn, and they do not know what to study, what to pursue? Yeah. Like what would you recommend for them as they start to think about what a career that might touch on neuroscience and philosophy might look like?
Well, it's a little bit difficult because it depends a little bit on the questions that you're really interested in. So that, for example, if you're really interested in a question like free will and what that might mean in the context of the criminal law, then you want to know as much as you can about the mechanisms in the brain for making decisions. And so you're going to need to know not only neuroscience, but you're going to need to know some psychology, because psychologists also have some data that's reliable on these issues. But then you're going to need to also understand something about the nature of the law, and then also a little bit about how philosophers traditionally, not necessarily most recently, but traditionally have thought about why we punish people, what the rationale is of punishment, and when it's considered fair or when it's considered unfair. So you need to know, you kind of have to spread yourself out. And that kind of sometimes takes a little bit of courage, because we're in a period now where there is so much to know in any one of those fields. You think, oh gosh, I better be quiet until I know everything in this field. Well, don't, because nobody knows everything in that field. And so the best thing I could suggest is that you have the courage to move forward, that you be sure that you have ways of organizing your time so you can actually learn, say, the neuroscience and the anthropology and the ecology, the psychology and the law, so that you can pursue your questions in a really meaningful way. So that kind of, if I may backtrack slightly, it suggests that you kind of have to have at least a general sense of what questions you're really interested in. So if you're interested in decision making and its impact on the law, that's one direction. But on the other hand, if you're interested in consciousness and what the mechanisms are and how unconscious operations and mechanisms integrate with conscious ones, then that's going to take you in a somewhat different direction. So if this is about graduate school, then it's always a good idea if you have a great passion for a big idea or a big question. And then in graduate school, that will narrow down and that will help you focus, and you'll figure out how to make some impact on answering that question. That's sort of how I think about it.
That's great advice, especially the bit about courage. It's certainly been my experiences.
As it, yeah.
Many folks will tell you it's too much, especially when you're young, wait till you're old. But I think taking those risks is exactly what you should do. So
yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to be embarrassingly arrogant. It just means, for one thing, don't be afraid to ask a stupid question. Mm-hmm. And, I used to talk about genetics with Francis Crick, and he never once made me feel like I was asking a stupid question, even though some of my questions almost certainly showed that I didn't know very much about genetics. And I think you'll find most decent people or most decent scientists are like that. They're not going to rub your nose in it and say, well, go away and learn and then come back in 10 years and we'll talk. So anyway, and if a scientist does say that to you, then my advice is go talk to another scientist. Get away from that person.
I think fair. Well, this is great. It's great advice. We'll put on the website for those watching more links to learn more about neurophilosophy and to read up. Thank you, Dr. Churchland, for your time today.
You're so welcome, Francis. Always a pleasure.